In the last module, we looked at how you can go out and create fields and entities inside the application. And that's great, but sometimes you're going to need a little bit more than just whether or not you want to store a date or a numeric value or text. You really want to go in and start doing some type of functionality. Maybe you have to subtract date fields on a timesheet entry to be able to calculate how much time you spent on a specific project. Or maybe you want to be able to go in and do a roll-up on all orders for a specific customer and display that on the account record so you have that information available. Or maybe you even need to go in and start locking down specific fields on an entity based upon who that user is to determine who has access to it. So inside Dynamics 365, there's several different field types that you can use to meet these criteria. And in this module, we want to take a look at the art of creating these specific fields to fit your needs. So what we're going to do is look at, creating these specific fields and defining how they're going to work within the context of the application, working with both calculated and rollup fields. So if you have very simplistic calculations, or maybe you have aggregated data that you want to surface inside the application, we'll go in and explore in a little bit more detail option sets. We talked about them in the previous module, but we'll look at them from storing them inside just the entity itself or making them globally available to any entity within the application. We'll talk a little bit about alternate keys and how you can use those to facilitate data integration with maybe third-party applications. We'll look at using Dynamics 365 field security to customize field security in the application. And then we'll talk just a little bit about state and status reason transitions and how those can be updated to fit your specific needs, maybe based upon different resolution processes that you might have associated with different entities in the application. As we talked about it in kind of the overview of this module, many times a customer's needs are going to require that you go out and create very specific fields to provide very specific functionality. And there's a lot of ways that from an application perspective you can accomplish that within Dynamics 365. Some of those different ways depend upon what the specific needs are. Historically, it's always been a scenario where a developer would kind of go in and maybe write a custom formula or facilitate some type of plugin or something like that that would be able to work with that. Or even in some cases, you had to use form scripting to be able to accomplish this. As the application has matured and as they've really tried to build in functionality to allow non-developers to do that, they've added many features that would allow you to be able to perform things like basic calculations in the application without having to reach out for a developer, or using rollup fields to go out and create aggregated data from not only maybe that record, but also related records in the application, or going in and locking down a form so based upon who somebody is, they can't modify specific information. And I can give you kind of an example of that. I worked with a customer a few years back, and they had service technicians that they would dispatch out on site, and these service technicians needed to be able to basically modify these work orders to let people know when they were completed. Well, the problem they were running into is there was kind of an estimated close date on those work orders, and these people were going in and modifying that estimated close date because maybe they were behind schedule, which started to throw off their entire schedule. And so what their dispatcher wanted to be able to do was to say, I don't care if they go in and modify the work order, that's fine. I just don't necessarily want them to go in and modify the estimated close date. If they need to push that back out, since that has scheduling impacts, I want to be able to go out and have them basically ask me for permission. And so we were able to use what are called field security and field security profiles to be able to facilitate that in the application. But then the other thing is, sometimes you have, different lists and different items that you want to be able to share across, and this is where some of these different field types that are available inside Dynamics 365 will give you some of those capabilities. One of the first ways that you can really start to tailor and customize the application to your needs is through what are called calculated fields. And so when you start working with calculated fields, this is where you can perform, basic calculations using fields from either the current record or even related records or the parent record inside the application itself. So I'll give you a couple of different examples. You see down at the bottom of the slide, it talks about, weighted revenue. So this might be a situation where I'm looking at the percentage or the probability of this opportunity to close combined with the estimated revenue, and based upon that situation, we're going to perform a calculation that multiplies maybe the percentage by the estimated revenue to give us a weighted revenue. That's one, very common example to where you might see calculated fields. Another example that people don't necessarily always think about is pulling information in from like a related parental record. So for example, like on my loan applications, I maybe want to have a contact phone number, and that contact phone number is going to be the phone number of the person applying for the loan. Well, the easiest way to be able to facilitate that would be through a calculated field that says, pull the phone number from the parent record. And so that way when we open up the record, it'll go out to the account record or the contact record, and it will subsequently pull in the phone number. And now if for some reason the phone number changes, it's automatically adjusted on the loan application as well. Now you have to look at different situations to define if that's ideally going to fit your specific needs. Sometimes maybe you just want to use field mapping, which we'll talk about in the relationship module, to push the information down and then subsequently give you the ability to overwrite it. But calculated fields have a variety of different use cases within the application. And the other thing that's nice about calculated fields is they do support conditions. So if you have a situation where, if this particular situation is met, so if this opportunity has an estimated revenue of over such and such, we're going to do this type of calculation. This would now give you the capabilities to facilitate what that would look like. And so you kind of see that down on the bottom where I want to set basically the amount to finance to the credit limit, also times 80% of their credit limit. So if their credit limit for the account is set to $10,000, I don't want them to be able to finance any more than $8,000. This would now give me the capabilities to define that. Now, these are specific field types within the application. So if you remember in the previous module when we were doing the demonstration, we showed you that the field type can be set to calculated. Now, calculated is only an option if the data type that you've chosen supports that. So that's going to be things like numeric fields, that's going to be things like single line of text. Even some of your option sets do support calculated fields from an option standpoint. The nice thing is based upon what data type you've chosen, the field type will automatically be available to choose calculated only for the fields that it supports. Now, once you've defined it, says, okay, this is going to be a calculated field, when you go in and hit edit, that is actually going to save the field in the application. Once it's saved, you cannot change the field type. You can always go in later and you can edit the formula. So clicking edit is going to save the field and then open up the editor, but you cannot change the field type once it's been saved that first time. So the other thing is if you have been working with Dynamics 365 for a while and you have some fields that you feel might be better served as calculated fields, there really isn't a mechanism to be able to go in and convert them. You pretty much would have to create them from scratch, build the formulas, and then define what you want to do with the old data in other situations. But again, the formulas that are actually backboning the calculated fields themselves, those can be modified at any time. Another option that you have are roll-up fields. And they do exactly what they sound like they do. They roll up information from related records as they correspond to a specific record inside the application. So a real good example of that, like we've talked about in the past, would be estimated revenues of opportunities for a specific account within the application. So I want to go out and I want to look at all of the open opportunities and I want to roll up that information based upon whether or not it's in progress. Now, what's cool about these roll-up fields is you also have the ability to pull in hierarchical information. So for example, you have this concept of an account, and this account might have sub-accounts associated with it. So when I'm doing these formulas or these roll-up fields, I can determine whether or not I want the sub-account information to also be rolled up as part of the parent. And that's kind of what you see over here on the side of the screen. It talks about what is the source entity that I'm doing the roll-up from. So the source entity is going to be the account entity. I then determine whether or not I want to use hierarchy. So do I want to include child accounts in this roll-up from a hierarchical standpoint? I can say yes or no. Then I define what is the related entity that I want to work with. So in this case, I want to work with opportunities or any opportunities where this account is set as the potential customer. So it knows to look at opportunities, and then I'm going to filter those opportunities down. So I only want to include opportunities where the status reason on those opportunities is set to in progress. So once I've determined that it is an opportunity that has been set for this specific account and the status of that opportunity is set to in progress, then I want to basically go out and do a sum on the estimated revenue for that opportunity. And there's several different functions available based upon the type of field that it is. You can sum that information, you can do a count or a min or a max or an average. Part of that's going to depend a little bit based upon the field type that you've chosen. But basically when you start talking about roll-up fields are really limited to numeric values, and in some cases you can do some roll-up information around date and time values as well. Another consideration that you have to look at when you're creating these fields are option sets. And an option set, as we talked about in the previous module, is really just a pick list. So I want to have a drop-down menu that's going to display, 5 or 6 different options that somebody can choose inside that specific record. Now, from a Dynamics 365 perspective, the values that it actually stores inside the table are integers. So if you remember when we were talking about solutions and doing solution publishers, there was that option set value prefix. Those are the values that actually get stored inside the Dynamics 365 database. From an application perspective, as far as what's going to be displayed to the actual end users consuming those, each one of those option sets will have labels that will be associated with those specific integer values that are stored inside the application. Now, from a customization perspective, I can customize both the options as well as the labels inside the application itself to fit my specific needs. Now, when you're talking about option sets, there's really 2 types of option sets that are available inside CRM. There's what are called local option sets, and then there's global option sets. Now, the difference is if it's a local option set, it means that you're storing that pick list or creating that option set only for one specific field on a single entity. So if I create a local option set for my loan applications, all of the values and all of the items associated with that are specific to the loan application entity. If I create what's called a global option set, now I have the ability to use that on more than one field across more than one entities. So one of the things that you have to look at is what is the intent of that option set? Is it something that is very targeted based upon what you're doing? So do I only have a couple of different loan application types that we're working with? Or is this more of a lending type procedure where we have different products and services that we offer? And in those cases, it might make more sense to have those options available across the board. A good example of that would be if you think about shipping methods. So if I'm going to ship something out to somebody, I might have a shipping method on the opportunity, but I also might have shipping method on orders. I might have it on invoices, all of those different types of situations. And so what's important is if I create a global option set in that scenario, I know that I have consistency across the board. I know that FedEx is always going to be associated with number 1, no matter who's using it. Whereas if I try to create each one of those locally, I could sometimes have some discrepancies in regards to the numbers. And this next slide actually really shows you this in a real good scenario. So if you think about how you're going to do like entity mapping, or if you're going to map fields from one entity to another, this is a very common example. I might have an event type and I might have a booking type. In essence, they're the same type of situation, but I've created them as separate option set values on each individual entity that I'm working with. So if I'm doing mapping between the 2 entities, for example, if I have product demo, well, I can see that product demo is defined with a label of 1 for event type as well as 1 for booking type. But I can see that they flipped market research and product launch around. Market research is 2 for event type, whereas it's 3 for booking type, and then product launch is 3 for event type as opposed to being 2 for booking type. The problem with that is if I'm going to do any mapping between fields, it maps upon the value or the numeric value, not the label. So it's going to put 2 across the board, and now I might actually have it be shown as product launch in booking types when it should be market research search or vice versa. And at the same point, if I don't have specific values available, it doesn't necessarily know how to work through those. So one of the things that we kind of tell people is look at how you're going to be working through that. And if you know that this might be used in multiple situations, you might want to consider going in and actually creating a global option set and then using that global option set across the board across multiple entities. Once you go in and have an option set that you've worked with, you do have the ability at any point in time to change the labels for existing and new records. So that's the nice thing, is if you ever need to make changes, you can certainly go ahead and do that. However, be aware of if you potentially go in and delete options that are being used currently by other records. So what happens is if I go in and delete an option set value from the application, the old records that are using that old value still retain that old value within those situations. They're not changed. As soon as somebody goes in and opens that record up, you will then have to update that record to the current default value. So what we kind of tell people is to avoid having kind of these orphaned records, or to have items that are not necessarily tied to active option set values. Sometimes it makes more sense to do something like advanced find beforehand. Go in, find all the options that are going to contain that value that is going to be deleted. Make the change very quickly to whatever the new value is going to be, or clear it out based upon what you want to do. That way, when you delete that, you know that you don't have these orphaned items just sitting up there within that scenario. Now, option sets are great, but you also have to look at what you're doing. If I'm doing shipping values and I'm sending out, DHL, UPS, FedEx, something like that, odds are that's not going to change very often. There's not going to be a lot of shipping providers that I'm going to use. But at the same point, I might have, if I'm looking at states, or I'm looking at specific types of functionality that we do, they may change a lot. And now going in and having to always update these option sets from a global perspective could create a lot of additional administration. So sometimes people will just create a custom entity and they'll just use a lookup field. That way, if these values are changing all the time, that doesn't matter, because anytime we add a new value, it's coming in as a custom item on that custom entity, and now we can just select that and move on from there. So sometimes it's about trade-offs and just deciding what's going to work best for you based upon the individual needs that you have. Another item that you have inside Dynamics 365 are what are called alternate keys. Now, through your standard customization principles that you're going to be working with, you may not use alternate keys very often, if at ever, to be very honest with you, depending upon the type of environment that you're working with. Where these really start to come into play is if you are integrating with external systems. So you're trying to take Dynamics 365 information and synchronize it with maybe a third-party ERP system or some type of custom application. And the problem you run into is sometimes those third-party applications, I really don't have a mechanism in place where I could take that GUID, or that uniquely identifying number inside Dynamics 365, and create a new field to store it in the third-party application. And so this is where alternate keys can come into play. What I can actually do with these alternate keys is I can create kind of a subsequent key inside Dynamics 365 that allows me to uniquely identify these records inside the application. And they could be a combination of 2 or 3 things. So for example, maybe I'm trying to integrate with a third-party application, and so I need to have their account ID. Well, the only way that I can uniquely associate that together is by using their account name and their account number and maybe their email address. So what I can do inside Dynamics 365 is I can create an alternate key called GP account ID, and then I can go in and I can say that GP account ID uses these 3 items. It uses account name, it uses account number, and email address. And the combination of those 3 records is what's ultimately going to define that as a unique record inside the application. And so now I could use that for some of my upsert operations and integration with other applications. Now, when you're defining these alternate keys, a couple things to remember is you really have basically 5 that you can do inside the application. Each alternate key has to have a unique name, but as I mentioned, if you need to, you can have one field or you can have multiple fields used to define the uniqueness of that record inside the application. So if you're ever looking to integrate with third-party external systems and you don't have a way to store CRM information inside there, this is where you would have the capabilities to create these alternate keys to kind of work through that. So let's first look at the calculated field perspective. So as I mentioned, there might be a scenario inside the loan application where I want to call somebody. And so to do that, I would want to know what their phone number is, and I ultimately might want to have that coming from the applicant's account number or the person who's applying for the loan. So I could do that through a calculated field. I can go in and I can click on New. I can define what I want to call this particular field. So in this case, I'm going to just say that I want to call this applicant phone. Now I'm going to come down here and I'm going to leave it a single line of text, but I'm going to change the field type to calculated. And the reason calculated is available is because calculated fields are an option for single lines of text. If this had been a whole number or a currency field or something like that, I would also see rollup value as an option here that I could work with as well. But in this case, we're going to go ahead and choose calculated. So I'll go ahead and hit edit. This will save the application inside, or the field inside the application itself, and then this will open up the editor. Now, at any point, I can come back and I could adjust this based upon my specific needs, but in this case, we'll just go ahead and kind of leave it where it sits now. So I'm going to go ahead and let this open up. If I wanted to have a condition as to when I would actually go through and run this calculation, I could do that. But in this case, I'll just say I need to populate this from the parent record. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to choose loan. And I can see that I have this loan underscore applicants, which basically defines this as the lookup field to the applicant's relationship inside the item that we created when we created the lookup field. Now in this case, I can hit my period, and it shows me here's all the additional fields that I would have the ability to use inside here. So I can see that I also have their phone number. So I could come in here and I could look at, address, phone number, main phone number. These are all the different items that would be available for me to work with inside this situation. So in this case, I'm going to choose telephone 1, which is the main phone number. So what this is going to do is this is going to go out, look at the account record, determine whether or not there is a phone number associated with it, and then feed it back in. Now, when we actually get into customizing forms, we'll bring all this in so you can actually see what it looks like, but this would be the definition for the calculated field. Once I hit this check mark here, this will then go out, validate it, make sure that this is a valid formula. If for some reason there was any errors inside the formula or something that wasn't going to work, it would then tell me at this point. So the other thing that's nice is it doesn't necessarily let you do something if it's not going to work inside the app. Now I could go ahead and hit save and close. Now I could use this same principle or this same process if I wanted to for roll-up fields. But from a roll-up field perspective, maybe I just want to see how many active loan applications this particular account has inside Dynamics 365. So in this case, maybe now I would go to the account entity and I would go to fields. And in this case, I would come in here and I would click on new field. And I'm going to call this total applications. I'm going to come down here and make this a whole number because I'm just looking for the individual situation that I'd be working through. The field type now, because this is a whole number and rollup is an option, I can go ahead and choose rollup. Now I can go ahead and hit edit. Same thing, it's going to save this field inside the database, but now it's going to create kind of the rollup editor that I could use to define how I want this to work through. So we'll give this just a sec to kind of finish loading up. It'll pull in my editor, and now I can kind of build the rollup aggregation method based upon those items. So in this case, what I would ultimately be wanting to know is active loan applications that have been applied for by this particular account. So in this case, I can see that I'm working off of the loan application from that particular item. I can define what specific items I want to work with. In this scenario, I can then go ahead and I could pick whatever items I wanted to work with. So this is where I could define the fields, the activities, whatever the specific thing I would be wanting to be working with. In this case, maybe we'll just go ahead and roll up active activities. And then I could come in here, and if I wanted to filter any of these additional situations, I could do that. And then my final scenario would be my aggregation. So this is where I can say, what is the item that I want to do in here? I want to count actual activities. So this will roll up all of the individual activities that would be associated with these loan applications. Now, I'm not necessarily going to save this one just because it doesn't necessarily fit into the demonstration scenarios that we want to do, but it does give me the capabilities to kind of show you what that process looks like. Now, the other thing I want to show you on the loan application, so let me click on loan application here real quick, and fields, is I want to show you that concept of global versus local option sets. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new option here, and I'm just going to call this loan type. And so and I'm not going to track a ton of different loan types, but we'll just do a few here. So I'm going to call this loan type. And down here, I'm going to make this a option set. So you'll see that I have a couple of different scenarios in here. I can choose to use an existing option set, or I can choose not to. If I choose not to, this is going to make this a local option set, which is only associated with the loan application entity. If I say I want to use an existing option set, this is what allows me to tie this to a global option set inside the application. Now, if I had already created a global option set for loan type, I would be able to see that in here just by using this drop-down menu, and I could work with it from there. If I don't necessarily have a option set for loan type, then I could actually create a new global option set right here. And the advantage to this is now this would be available for anybody to use inside other entities as part of the application. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to call this loan type. And then I would come down here and I would add my specific values. So the first item I see when I add here is an item with kind of a predetermined value based upon the prefix. I'm just going to call this, let's call this home loan. Now I'm going to add another one. I will call this auto. And then maybe we'll add one more called business. And then as I've save and close this, now this option set or this global option set is created inside the application, and it would be available for me to associate with any entity. And so you'll see that it uses the loan type option set, and then I can use to define any default values that I want to work with in here. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and leave it unassigned. And now when I hit save and close, I will see that not only do I have this option inside the application, but if I were to go into option sets now, I can see that this option set has also been added to my solution. And so this will now transport on when I export this out and import it into a new environment. Now, if you've gone in and done the Configuring Dynamics 365 for Sales and Service course, you're very comfortable or familiar with the concept of security roles. And security roles basically say, based upon who you are, this is what you can do to a specific entity. So I can edit accounts, but I can only edit accounts that I own or something to that nature. When you define a security role for somebody and you say this is what you can do, the security role gives them that permission to that entire entity. So if I say that I can edit any account that I own, I can literally go into any field and make any changes as long as I own that account record. Well, that's not always ideal in every single situation. And so sometimes you have to look at it at a more granular level and look at it specifically on a field by field basis. And that's where this concept of field security comes into play. And so what field security does is it allows you to lock a field down to specific users or subsets of users inside the application. And what's cool about field security is the fact that it doesn't matter how somebody accesses that record. If they look at it through a view, if they look at it through a form, if they're going through audit logs, charts, any way they access that information from the application, it looks at who they are, and if they shouldn't have access to that field, it locks them out and does not provide access to that field. And so this is really the best way to prohibit somebody from being able to work with specific fields. Now, the nice thing about field security is this is something that you can apply across different field types. You can work with system fields, you can work with custom fields. So there's no real limit. There's some fields, lookup fields, and there's some GUID fields that don't necessarily have the capabilities to do field security. But for the most part, every field within CRM, whether it's system or custom, can have field security applied to it. Now, the big thing to remember with field security is once you apply security to a field, nobody has access to that field anymore with the exception of the system administrator. So anybody who's been defined as a system administrator and added to what's called the system administrator field security profile would not have access to it. So as soon as you make a field secured, what you'll see, like with this birthday field down here on the item, is it'll have a little lock next to it, and nobody has access until you specifically go in and assign them access to that field based upon who they are or what team they belong to. So anybody who does not have system administrator rights does not have access to those secured fields unless you otherwise specify. Now, the way you do that is you do that through what are called field security profiles. And so what a field security profile does is it allows you to go in and specify who should have what access to what secured fields inside the application and what specific permissions they should be able to have. So for example, when you go in and create a field security profile, it's going to show you every field in the system that's been deemed as a secured field. You have to then go in and say, okay, these are the users and or teams that would typically belong to this field security profile. Then you go in and you specify for each field listed in that profile what they can do. So can they read it? Can they update it? Can they create it? Those types of different situations. And you have to define that for each field security profile that you want to have in the application. So you might have a field security profile for salespeople. You might have one for service people. The salespeople have access or more access to salesy related fields, and the service people have more access to servicey related fields. The big thing to remember is the permissions that you're working with are independent for each other. So for example, I might have the ability to update a field, but not necessarily read the information in that field. And so you have to remember that, just because you have update permissions doesn't mean that you can see the value in there. There's obviously going to be a scenario where I may want people to be able to put information in, but not see the information that's been put in there once the record's been saved. And so you have to look at that from a security standpoint to determine whether or not that's actually going to work from that standpoint. Once you've gone in and you've applied field security works in conjunction with their security roles. And so if you think about how security works in Dynamics 365, it kind of works at this level. It starts at kind of an entity level. So it looks at the entity itself and it looks at what security roles this user has, and based upon their security roles says whether or not they can make changes to this entity. Then it's done at a record level. So at a record level, I would have the ability to share out specific records with somebody. Maybe I'm going on vacation and I want to provide Bob access to my accounts. I could share out my accounts with Bob, and then he would specifically have the ability to edit those. But at the same point, if those records have secured fields associated with them, the only real way that they can have access to those fields is through their field security profile. So there's kind of a three-tier situation. So it combines this field security with security profiles. And so it looks at kind of their least restrictive field security profile and their least restrictive security role. So again, if you've taken the configuration course and you understand kind of how security roles work, a user can have one or more security roles associated with their account. If one of them gives them doesn't give them the ability to edit an account, but one does, whatever gives them the most access is what they're granted. It's the same thing with security profiles from a field security standpoint. If I have read access on one field security profile, but I don't have it on another, that is going to give me read access. And then what happens is it takes those two situations, and what is ever the most restrictive of those two models wins. So for example, a user who has update access to a record and read permissions to a secured field can only read that field. Even though I can go in and I can update that every other field on that record, because my field security profile gives me only read permissions to that specific field, I can only see the information in that field. I can't modify it like the other fields that I could for that particular entity. Let's examine how this would work inside the application. So if you think about from a loan application perspective, I probably want to get somebody's social security number. Well, social security numbers I don't necessarily just want to have floating around inside the application for everybody to see. So I might want to make that a secured field. And so I already have a field in here for applicant social security number, but I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to open that up inside my loan management solution. And when I open this up, one of the items that I'll see in here is I'll see field security. So I want to enable field security. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and enable field security and hit save and close. And so now that I have field security enabled for this field, the next thing is now nobody has access to it. So if I were to open this up inside the application, anybody who had the ability to work with the loan application would not see or be able to edit that social security number. So this is where my field security profiles come in. Now again, best practice situation is I'm in the loan management solution. So it would make sense that I should create these field security profiles inside the loan management solution, so when I actually export this out, all of this information comes across. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go into my field security profiles and I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to go ahead and add a new security profile. And in this case, maybe I'm just going to call this, loan officer or something to that nature. So we'll just go ahead and call this loan officers. And then I'm going to save this. And so once I save this, now I'm able to actually go in and start modifying this. Now the first thing that I'm going to see in here is the members. So who are going to be a members of the loan officer's field security profile? Now there's a couple of different ways that you can facilitate this, but again, if you've done much with the configuring course, you know there's this concept of teams inside Dynamics 365. And the reason why teams are nice is because now I could just add this team to the field security profile. I can add or remove members to the team as needed, or as people leave or get promoted or whatever the situation is. And now I know that my field security profile is always up to date. If I do users, which is absolutely 100% acceptable, the only problem you run into is now every time somebody leaves or transfers jobs or whatever that item might be, I would have to come in and modify my field security profile to reflect that. So in this case, teams might be a better option from this standpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a team or add a team to this. I don't necessarily have any teams within this item, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new team, and I'm just going to call this team loan officers. So give it just a sec here to pull in my team creation option. I'm going to go ahead and call this loan officers. I'm going to save this. I'll make myself in charge of it. Then I'm going to go ahead and save it. Then I could add members to the team if I wanted to, but for today's purposes, we'll just add the loan officers. I'll go ahead and hit add. Then I come down into my field permissions. And so this is where I can see every kind of field that we have associated with this. Now, in this case, I don't necessarily see the field that I created for that loan officer or social security number. And the reason behind that is because when I changed it or I made it secured, I didn't do what was called publish my customizations. So I'm just real quick going to go ahead and save and close this field security profile. I'm going to come up into my area here and just publish all customizations. Normally you just publish your customizations on kind of an entity or field by field basis, but in this case, just to make sure that everything is pushed out, I'm going to publish all my customizations, which is going to make it live inside the system for everything to kind of work with. So once this is done publishing, now I can go back into my loan officers, and when I open this up, I should see that particular field or secured field in there. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to show this, because every once in a while you'll run into a situation where you don't necessarily have to publish stuff like you saw with some of the fields and some of the calculated field options. And then every once in a while you run into a situation where those customizations do need to be published before they're reflected in the application. And field security is usually one of those areas where the items have to be published. Auditing is also, in some cases, another one of those items. Same with form customization. So if you're expecting to see something in somewhere and you're not actually seeing it, then you will have to go in, typically just publish the customizations real quick. Once those customizations are published, then you would be able to go in and actually facilitate working with that as part of the application. So now I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And then I'll go ahead and go back into field permissions. And now, since it's been published, there's that applicant social security number. So now I can go ahead and double click on this and then define what specific permissions I want them to be able to have. Now remember, as we talked about, these are independent from each other. So do I want people who are members of loan officers to be able to see this? Yeah, I probably want them to be able to see it. I do want them to be able to update it. And I probably also want them to be able to create as well. But I could do whatever I wanted. If I wanted them to be able to enter a social security number and then not be able to change it or see it from that point forward, I could also do that in here as well. It really just depends upon what your specific security needs are. Now I can go ahead and click on OK, and now everything is set up and ready to go. Now, from this perspective, anybody logging in as that particular user who's a member of the loan officers team would now have those particular permissions, whereas everybody else logging in would not be able to work with it. And so this is just a great way that you can add kind of one extra dimension of security to your application. The other thing that you want to keep in mind when you're working with records is each record has this concept of what's called a status or a status reason. And a status inside Dynamics 365 is the state of the record. And for the most part, most entities are going to have really one of two states. They're either going to be active or they're going to be inactive. Some entities, depending upon what they are, might have more than two or might use different names for these states. Opportunities might be one of those situations where you might see opportunities as open and closed. Invoices would be another one of those scenarios where they might be open or closed. So you might see some scenarios where there might be exceptions to that, but for the most part, what you're going to see is most records are going to be either active and inactive, and you really don't have any customization options around that from a status reason perspective, or from a status perspective. Now, the other thing that you have is this, what's called the status reason, and that works in conjunction with the status. And so each one of these statuses can actually have different status reasons associated with it. So for example, I might have a scenario where I have an opportunity that's open, but while it's open, I might be researching it as part of my status reason, or I might be doing some, on hold. It might be on hold because I'm waiting for some type of information from the customer. What's nice about the status reasons is now I can actually go in and start defining more specific detail around those individual situations. So each item, for example, from a custom entity perspective, come with status reasons of active and inactive. You would have the ability to go in based upon your specific scenarios and actually add or define additional status reasons or rename ones that are on there. So for example, you might have a status reason for a loan application. The loan application is currently active. Okay, it's active, but from a status reason standpoint, it's been submitted. Then once we get a pre-approval scenario, it's still active, but now they've been pre-approved. And so this is where you can use these status reasons to allow you to see more specifically what's actually happening inside those records. And so you do have the capabilities from a customization standpoint to go in and not necessarily customize the status or the state of the record, but for the status reason, you can go in and provide additional detail based upon those options. The other thing that's kind of cool with these status reasons is you can do what are called status reason transitions. And these are really more specifically targeted at the case and custom entities. But if you think about it, I might have a situation where I'm working on a case. That case might be in progress, might be canceled, it might be escalated to service, or I might be researching that. So there might be different situations that I'm working with as part of those individual situations. What's nice about this is I can define status reason transitions that would allow me to define where I can move from each one of those situations. So for example, when I have a case that is in a researching scenario, I can either move that case to in progress or move it to on hold. I can't necessarily move it to, waiting for details or something like that. Same thing with in progress. When something is in progress, I can't go back to researching because the thought process being that I would have already researched it. So what happens with these status reason transitions is you can define how people move from each one of those individual situations. And what's nice about this is you can define, okay, from an in progress standpoint, I can either put the case on hold, I can cancel it, or I can solve it. From a service escalated scenario, it's either been canceled, merged, solved, or I provided them info. You have to make sure that you allow them to go to at least one active status and one inactive status. So you can see here that merged and cancels represent an inactive status of not necessarily a negative scenario, but not completed scenario, whereas green represent a positive or a completed situation. So as long as I define how it's going to move through its resolution process, this is where I can kind of customize that to fit my specific needs. These are a great way to add kind of that your own little processes to a specific record, particularly on the case and custom entities inside the application. During this module, we started to look at some of the more specialized customizations that you could use to really start to tailor the functionality based upon what you need to do. One of the ways you can do that is through calculated fields. And with calculated fields, you have the ability to not only perform calculations, but you can use them to populate Dynamics 365 record data from other fields or records inside the application. If you're looking to provide summaries of information and roll up information from other related information inside the application, you can use Rollup Fields to actually aggregate that data based upon whether or not it's that particular record or maybe a subsequent child record inside the application. You also might find that on a few different occasions, the way that you have the security structured inside Dynamics 365 needs more than just whether or not somebody can work with an account or a contact record. They may need to actually have restrictions to specific fields based upon who they are and what those items are. So through Dynamics 365's field security feature, we have the ability to go in and define what specific fields they can work with regardless of how that information is accessed. So it's really about trying to find the right fields for you and the right field types based upon what specific things you need to do inside the application.